So we start. So as I said last week, the only difficulty for the Russo-Semmelweis theorem is to get from the aspect ratio 1/2, 1/2 to the aspect ratio, to any aspect ratio which is strictly larger than 1. And so we choose here the 3/2. For some technical reason, I'm going to present to you the, I guess, simplest proof we know of the Russo-Semmelweis theory today. It is a much simpler proof than the original one, but it's still based on the same ingredients. So we will see maybe a proof in the case of dependent models, which is a little bit more complicated, but which is not harnessing independence. So here it's going to be based on independence. Okay. So the idea is the following. So let's take our n, so minus n, and 2n box like that. And let's first start by picking the box 0 n squared. Okay, let's look at this box. So in this box, let's imagine I draw a path, gamma, of open edges on this. Okay, let's pick any path, so fix gamma. I would like to know what is the probability that if I remove this area here, what is the probability that there is an open path from bottom here to here, which is in this area, in this box. In this area, in this box. Can somebody tell me what is, a lower bound on the probability of having a path like that? So up to now, we don't have so much tools, right? We only know about self-duality. So the idea is going to be to try to construct a symmetric domain and to use that either there is a path or, to use the FKG inequality to try to prove that we cross from here to here. So the idea is the following. Just draw the symmetric. So this is going to be sigma of gamma. The symmetric of gamma under the reflection under this line. So now you have a new domain, which is everything which is below this guy. What is the probability to have a path from there to the top of this domain? Well, the probability to have a path. So let's fix, and let sigma of gamma be the symmetric of gamma with respect to the line E times R. And let S of gamma to be the subset of minus n squared below this below gamma union sigma of gamma. So I take this guy, which is this set which is below. What is the probability, a lower bound on the probability at 1/2, that gamma union sigma of gamma is connected to the bottom of S of gamma in S of gamma? How can I bound this from below? Well, let's just ignore that I have this set. The probability of going from the bottom to the top is 1/2. Right? So this probability is larger or equal to 1/2. So this is larger or equal to 1/2. Now, gamma and, the probability that this path, that there is a path which finishes at gamma, and the probability that there is a path that finishes at sigma of gamma is the same. So the FKG inequality tells you that or just the union bound actually, tells you the property that gamma is connected in S of gamma to the bottom of gamma, of S of gamma. This is larger than 1/4. Okay? So this was just one observation. So now let's try to prove that that we have a crossing from bottom to top. So what we are going to do is the following. We are going to assume first, we are going to prove that there is a crossing from bottom to, which is connected to a crossing like that. So here I fix the gamma. So this is not a random variable. Now I'm going to make it random. So let's look at the probability at 1/2 that there exists a path of open edges connecting an horizontal crossing of 0n² to minus nn times minus n. Okay, so I want now that this guy is a typical crossing, horizontal crossing of this thing. So this I can do the following. I can say, okay, the probability of having a crossing in 0n² times the probability of my event, let's call it A, this whole event, let's call it A. My event A, knowing that I have a crossing, right? This is just basic probability. And so now here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to decompose with respect to the highest most such crossing. So let's define gamma to be the highest most crossing of 0n². Horizontal crossing of 0n². What is important with respect to gamma is that here is an observation which is going to be really crucial, is that the event gamma is equal to a certain deterministic path gamma. It's measurable only in terms of edges which are on gamma or above gamma. So this is measurable in terms of edges on gamma or above gamma. Why? Because you need to know that it's a crossing. So you need to know that all the edges of gamma are open. That's the first thing. You need to know that it's the highest most crossing. So that means what? That means that you should check that at no point I have something like that. So let's imagine this is my gamma. So I check it's a crossing. Then here, I'm not allowed to have anything like that. Because otherwise, that means this was not the highest most crossing to start with. So here, usually, the type of picture you are going to get is something like that. So you need to know somehow that all the edges above like that are closed, like that. It's so I never said that gamma was a self-avoiding path. Okay, so it could look like that. But you need to know that it's the highest most. So you need to know that above it, edges are closed. But you don't need to know anything about what is below. So in particular, if I condition on gamma, my random variable, to be equal to this small gamma, then the only information I have is information in this dash area. So everything else is independent percolation. Okay? So when I'm there, I can say, okay, this thing is equal. So the first thing is 1/2. Well, it's larger or equal, in fact, because we said it was larger or equal to 1/2. And this thing now, I'm going to decompose over any type of gamma. I'm not even saying what gamma is, because you are going to see it's not going to be so important. And here it's going to be probability at 1/2 of A, knowing that gamma is equal to gamma, times probability of gamma equal to gamma knowing, actually I'm maybe boring, that's good like that. Knowing that there is a crossing. Okay, so I just cut my event, I partition my event into all these things. Here you see I don't want to tell you what gamma is simply because anyway, this thing is going to be 0 for any gamma which is not admissible somehow. So, I mean, I don't need to be careful about that. Very well. Now this thing, we said since, because of this property, the probability of having A knowing that gamma is equal to gamma is simply the probability, it's larger or equal to the probability of the event that I described there. In fact, it's actually equal to this probability. So it's always larger or equal to 1/4. So this is larger or equal to 1/8 sum of a gamma of the probability of gamma is equal to gamma knowing this. And what is this equal to, the last quantity? Well, the set gamma equal gamma, they partition this set, this event, so this is just 1. So I get 1/8. So that was the main part of the proof, because now we are done. So if I want to cross this event, if I want to cross this box, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that this event A occurs. So I'm going to assume that I have a crossing from bottom to top, which is connected to a path like that. I'm going to assume the same event at the top. But notice there is, it could be like that. It could be that there is a path like that and a path going at the top like that. So these two paths, they do not, these two clusters, they do not necessarily intersect. But what I can use is the fact that I can also assume that there is a crossing in this box, a vertical crossing in this box. And then I necessarily have a crossing from bottom to top. So the conclusion is just going to be the FKG inequality, which is telling me the probability at 1/2 of my crossing like that is going to be larger or equal to probability at 1/2 of the event A squared, because I need to use it at the bottom and its reflection at the top, times the probability at 1/2 of crossing the box like that, the small box like that. So this is going to be larger than 1/64. Okay? Is it clear for everybody, this proof? So now it's very short, but somehow it took a few years, like the historical proofs were actually a little bit more intricate. They were always based on the same idea. So what did we use here? We use symmetry at many places. Here we use vertical symmetry, symmetries with respect to this line. Here we use symmetry like that because we are using the dual path. We used before the duality. So most arguments, they were using symmetries. Actually, duality you don't need, in fact, but here we use. So we use symmetry. So this is really we use something else. We use that condition here when we got there. We use that conditioning on that was telling us no information about what was below the path. So this is really due to independence. Below we had Bernoulli percolation. So we use independence. I'm going to actually also say we use the highest most crossing. So we use also a notion of highest most. Highest crossing. Yeah, don't need to. Okay. Sorry. Highest crossing. And the last thing that we use in this proof was duality. We used it before to say that we had 1/2 for the square. So let me just tell you a little bit which properties are so important here. So we actually do not believe that independence is important. But we have very few proofs that work outside of independence. And we use the FKG inequality. Okay, but this FKG inequality. So in fact, we have a few arguments that work in greater generalities and independence, and which are in particular due either to me, Vincent, and Vlad Acidoravicius, or only to Vincent for some weaker version of it. So, which use mostly FKG inequality. But let's say that these are still specific to a few problems, so there are no like very big conceptual proof which get completely rid of this independence. So this is very important. But we are getting there, basically. Symmetries of the lattice, this is extremely difficult. We don't know at all how to get rid of that. So this is really not natural somehow as an assumption. But this, we don't know how to get rid. Highest crossing, so this is interesting. Imagine you want to ask the same question on, say, a slab of height 2. Take Z2 times 0, 1. Two copies of Z2, you just connect them like that. As the same type of question. Becomes extremely intricate because you don't have this notion of highest most. It's like a path in 2D, it screens you from what is on the other side. If you are on this side, you don't really know what is on the other side of your open path. You are going to see we are going to use this type of properties when we will work with the random cluster model. This is not true in higher dimension. In particular, you see, if you manage to say at some point we said, okay, if we have probability 1/2 to go from there to there, then going from there to there is easier because you need to cross these things. The guy is really screening you from what is on the other side. This is not true in higher dimension, and that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult in 3D to manage to do something with this type of reasoning. So this is really something like planarity is extremely important here. And in fact, in high dimension, it's not true, this type of theorems. Probability tends to 1. And it's due to the fact that you don't have a good notion of highest most, and two paths, if you want two clusters, if you want them to intersect, it's going to be a nightmare because there is so much space in your lattice. Duality is not important at all, in fact. Here you can completely get rid of this one. But the argument is a little bit more tricky, so I thought I would just get rid of that. Okay, and FKG inequality, this also is very important. As soon as you want to combine events, if you don't have the FKG inequality, you are doomed. Basically, you can go home. Okay? So that was just a few commentaries on the hypothesis. Let me tell you a little bit, without proof, because actually you have a few of these exercises in your exercise sheet. But let me try to tell you a little bit what you can do with the Russo-Seymour wedge. Why is it so important? Okay. So, a few consequences. So the first thing, corollary, is the following. Okay, so maybe let me start by saying, so here what we did is we took larger and larger boxes with some prescribed aspect ratio. You can see it in a dual way and say, okay, I fix a shape, and I take a smaller and smaller mesh size lattice. It's exactly the same, right? It comes down to just looking from farther away to the same graph. So that's what we call taking the scaling limit. So the scaling limit is the following. You just consider the model. The model on delta times Z2 and let delta tends to 0. Okay? And now with this notion, I can, for instance, express the following corollary, which is let omega A, B, C, D be a topological rectangle. I'm going to tell you what this is. and I'm going to take, donc we assume, well, okay, so it's a real topological rectangle. Then there exists a constant C, which depends only on this topological rectangle, such that the probability at 1/2, if you take your topological rectangle, you take 4 points on the, so the 4 points A, B, C, and D on the boundary. The probability of having a path from the arc AB to the arc CD, so a path from there to there, when you assume that the mesh size is delta, this probability is always smaller than 1 minus C and larger than C. So what is a topological rectangle? It's just a simply connected domain with 4 distinct points on the boundary. If you don't want to take a too large generality, because what you mean by a boundary when you have, for instance, slits like that or things like that, let's not, I don't want to discuss prime ends or things like that, so let's just take a Jordan domain. Okay, take a C1 curve, 4 points on the boundary, you get a topological rectangle. Okay? So because you have a topological rectangle with 4 points on the boundary, you can define the arcs AB, BC, CD, and DA. And you can ask the probability. Now I take a mesh size delta. I look at the intersection of this guy with the lattice delta Z2. And I look at whether I have an open path from one arc to the other one. Okay? Well, whatever the topological rectangle, there exists one constant C, such that you are larger than C and smaller than 1 minus C. Okay, so let's try just, I'm not going to prove this because it's, I'm just going to convince you that it's true. It's very simple to translate this into an actual proof. So you have your topological rectangle, you have your 4 points on the boundary. So if you want to cross from there to there, what you do is you take epsilon, fixed but small, and you just create a path like that of boxes 2 epsilon by epsilon. Just so far there is no lattice delta. Just you create a path like that. And then what you're going to assume now, if I fix now, if delta is any kind of any delta small enough, here you are just going to say, okay, I assume that all these rectangles are crossed like that. And if I manage to find, which is always possible, a sequence of boxes like that such that I arrive on the other side, I would have crossed the whole rectangle. What cost did I pay? I paid C2. So by the FKG inequality, I pay more than the product of the probabilities, which is C2, which is the price of crossing such a rectangle, to the number of rectangles I need. So to a certain n of epsilon. But notice epsilon is fixed. So for any delta, I'm going to pay C2 to the n of epsilon. N of epsilon is fixed. So this is what I will call my constant C. So this is this constant. Now to get the other one, how do? I simply notice that getting the upper bound for this guy is getting the lower bound for the other rectangle, topological rectangle, which is omega BCDA. And this one I can also make the same reasoning and get a lower bound. So you can translate this into into a proof. There is no difficulty there. But the point is, any shape is actually working. And the reason for that is actually that the result is much stronger than that. The truth is much more interesting than that. So we have a quantity that doesn't converge to 0, it doesn't converge to 1. So it may fluctuate a priori, but in fact the truth is that it doesn't. So there is a theorem which is actually really due to Smirnov, but it's sometimes people call it Cardy-Smirnov because the formula was predicted by Cardy, but it had nothing to do with the proof, which says the following. In fact, there exists a function f from the family of topological rectangles such that for any omega a, b, c, d, you have that the limit when delta tends to 0 of the probability of the crossing that I was talking about. So omega a, b, c, d, mesh size delta having a crossing like that. The limit of this crossing probability is f of omega a, b, c, d. So in fact, it converges. But even better than that, if I take a conformal map for any omega a, b, c, d, and for any conformal map, so conformal map is just, I mean, you have different ways of defining that, but it's a one-to-one holomorphic map, simply. So one-to-one map, which is differentiable in the complex sense. Otherwise, you can also see it as just a map which preserves angles. For any conformal map, you have that f of phi of omega, phi of A, phi of B, phi of C, phi of D. So f, when I evaluate it on the image by this conformal map of omega A, B, C, D, is in fact just f of omega A, B, C, and D. So this is called conformal invariance. And you are going to have a full class on this during the second term by Stas, where he will prove this theorem, by the way. So this is a beautiful prediction if you think about it. Because if I mean, yeah, there are many conformal maps, so in particular the rotation. So if you take a rotation by pi over 2, it's clear that because it's a rotation of your lattice itself, you are going to get if you take this domain, you look at the crossing probability, or if you take the rotation by pi over 2 of this domain, you are going to indeed converge to the same crossing probability. That's clear. But what I'm saying is that it's true for any conformal map, in particular for any rotation. You can prescribe any angle you want, you are going to get the same limit. So there are symmetries emerging in the scaling limit. And this is one of the, this is one of the beautiful properties of all these models, which is that they get more symmetries. And the more symmetries, the less degree of freedom you have somehow, so the better you can describe your model. So I'm going to mention a few more things later on related to that. So this conformal, okay, let me finish maybe to state the theorem and then just give you a few names which are important there. The last property is that, well, the conformal, the Riemann mapping theorem tells you that you can always map a conformal, a topological triangle into another one. Whatever the two simply connected domain with 3 points on the boundary, you can map them one to the other by some conformal map. This is the Riemann mapping theorem. Here I have 4 points, so I don't have the freedom for the fourth point. But I can send A, B, and C, and omega to an equilateral triangle, always. Then the last point, D, is going to be mapped to some point on the boundary of the last, so I can always map to a triangle like that, with A, B, and C be the image of A, B, C. But the last point is going to be around here. It's going to be D. So let's assume that here this is length 1. Okay? Well, f of this domain, if I put x here, because I don't control AD, or I should not, it's just AD. Just that. So for this simply connected domain, the probability, if you take a big triangle like that, 1 by 1 by 1, you put a point at distance x, the probability to cross from here, maybe I should be careful with, I said so. So I want this to be A, B, C, and D. So this probability crossing from there to there is x in the limit, of course, in the scaling limit. So this is a priori not clear. Huh? That's really not. So I'm telling you, in fact, f is equal to this on this specific family of topological rectangles. And this, therefore, you notice it defines f for any conformal, any topological rectangle, because any topological rectangle is going to be mapped to one of these guys. Okay? So this is the end of the theorem. I'm not going to prove it because you will prove it in, actually you will not prove that, but you're going to prove something related to that in the second term. And notice here, if x equal to half, it's clear because it's self-symmetry. Once again, you have self-duality. So in this specific case, it's clear, but in the general case, it works as well. So just some remarks. So in fact, Smirnov proved this result for side percolation on the triangular lattice. So he didn't prove it here. So in fact, here, it's a conjecture for the square lattice. And then I think it's worth attributing it to both. So it's side percolation on triangular lattice. And we don't know how to prove it for the square lattice. A priori, it's because, there is no reason why, let's assume we prove it for some model, why it would be simple to prove it for another model. In fact, a priori, there is no reason this should be the same answer. But there is a concept which is called the concept of universality, which is telling you that whatever the model you take at criticality, in planar case at least, you should get the same result. I will go back to this concept a little bit later in the class. But the models in the discrete are different. In the scaling limit, you get the same answer. It's like they are some discrete version of the same continuum object, which is really percolation with a big P. That didn't sound good at all, but anyway. Smirnov for that. So conformal invariance, was predicted in the 80s, in fact, even maybe earlier, but that's in the 80s, by Belavin, Polyakov, and Zamolodchikov. And because there is absolutely no way I'm going to spell them right, I'm just going to not spell them at all. So by physicists. And there is already little chance that I was going to spell physicists right, so but I tried. Anyway, so this is not a specific property of percolation. Any critical planar model should have a conformally invariant scaling limit. Okay. That was one of the things I wanted to mention. So these crossing probabilities. So you see, you have your model. It's really think that way. You have your model on a big box. Instead of thinking of this box as being big, you just go to the right distance to see it basically of size 1. So now it's on a very small mesh size. And you want to understand, you are looking at percolation, so you want to understand the connectivity properties of this object. So how can you do? Well, the first thing is to say, okay, I have my box like that. For instance, if I give you two configurations, can you tell me they are close to each other, they are far from each other, and so on? One way to measure how close they are from the point of view of connectivity properties would be to give myself, for any topological rectangle in my box, to tell me whether it's cross or not. No, instead of giving me all the information of all the single edges, fix an epsilon, look at any topological rectangle of size larger or equal to epsilon, where, this you need to really make sense of that, but you can have a notion of that. And just tell me, okay, this one is cross, this one is not, this one is cross, this one is not, etc., etc. If I fix epsilon small enough, you agree that, I mean, if you tell me, okay, I want to know whether these two objects are close up to a certain margin of error, then if I fix an epsilon small enough and I look at all the crossings of these topological rectangles which are larger than epsilon, or let's say a sufficiently fat family of such topological rectangles, then I'm going to be able to tell you, oh, from the point of view of connectivity, these two guys are very close to each other or not. So you can, I'm just trying, without actually using big words, to say you can define a topology on the limiting scaling limits, which is naturally defined by this, whether you cross macroscopic rectangles or topological rectangles or not. So this is a topology that was introduced by Schramm and Smirnov, and that allow you to describe fairly well what is happening in the, I mean, to discriminate between different properties of your scaling limit. The problem is that it's not very explicit. If you think about it, you know, I mean, for instance, whether, you know, you have things, let's say I give you this rectangle, if this one is crossed, then this one is also crossed, so you have already like a lot of redundant information. Then how do you extract, I don't know, if I give you this information, how do you extract whether, I don't know, whether there is a path from there to there? No, there is a path like that. Is there a path like that or not in my configuration? If I give you only the information on this crossing of rectangles, of topological rectangles, it's not so easy to know whether you are going to manage to make a crossing from this annulus to this one, I mean, in this annulus or something like that. So this topology is useful, but it's not very tractable. You cannot do much. So what can we do? I mean, can we do something else to try to say that, I mean, to try to describe a scaling limit? Well, what you can do is you can try to get the interfaces in your model. No, you have these primal clusters, this cluster of blue. They are in cluster of green. So in between there are loops. You can try to describe the loops. It's going to give you some kind of loop soup, you know, like when you look at your Chinese soup, you have like no, you don't know. No, that's terrible. It sounds much better when a physics medalist say that. You know, everybody's like, oh yes, I see the soup, yeah. But when I say it, every single time people look at me, you never saw a Chinese soup in your life. It doesn't look like that at all. Bon. Anyway, okay, so you can try to describe all the loops in your model, and they are never going to intersect because there are loops between different clusters. And then from there, it's very often much simpler to see what are the properties. For instance, if I look at this event, can somebody tell me what this event corresponds to in the case of the loops? It is, yeah?
No loops around the origin.
Exactly. There are no loops in this annulus separating this guy from the outside. Because if there is a loop, that means that there is a cluster which is blocked. Like there is an interface between green and blue. So there is no path going from an interior to exterior. So you see that this guy is going to be much simpler in terms of connectivity properties like that. So this guy is a little bit tough to describe right away, but you have indeed a theorem that tells you, which is due to Kamiya, Newman, and Stas. Even though he didn't prove it, it's in fact, I mean, the common belief is that this is really the main step, proving this conformal invariance. So some people actually refer also to Smirnov as the person that proved that, which is if I look at the interfaces in my domain, so I look at, let's say, gamma, or let's say L of omega to be the family of loops, and I look at it in delta, with mesh size delta, so I look at the families that I get when I take mesh size delta. This thing converges when delta tends to 0. So for any omega any simply connected domain omega, any simply connected domain omega. So L delta of omega is converging to what we call CLE6, so the conformal loop ensemble of parameter 6. Once again, this you are going to have a class on this in the second term on SLEs and CLEs, so I'm not going to describe you, but I just want describe it to you, sorry. But I just want to highlight the fact that you have in fact a very precise description of what is going on in the limit. Once again, on the triangular lattice. We don't know at all what is happening on the square lattice because we already don't even have convergence of the crossing probabilities. But once you have that, you can deduce, in fact, much more. In fact, you can also start by describing only one interface, and then you will converge to what is named Schramm-Loevner evolution. But here, since I'm not going to use it, I'm not going to mention this now. Okay, so that was for the crossing probabilities and the connectivity properties. Let's look at another corollary of my Rousseau-Simon-Welch theory, which is the fact that there exists a constant C positive such that if I look at the probability at 1/2 of 0 connected to the boundary of my box of size n, well, it decays like faster than C over n and smaller than 1 over n to the C. So remember that we said that we were not decaying exponentially fast at criticality. In fact, you really decay like a polynomial. And this is a consequence of the Rousseau-Simon-Welch theory. And what this, I think, is really in the exercises, so maybe I don't want to describe it. And for people who are not making doing the exercises, then you can come and ask me, and I will explain to you. It's fairly easy. It's not. But in fact, the truth, once again, theorem, which once again is theorem conjecture, so it's a conjecture on Z2, it's a theorem on the side percolation for triangular lattice, is that in fact, the probability at 1/2 of 0 connected to the boundary of the box of size n is 1 over n to the 5 over 48 plus little o of 1. As everybody would have guessed at the beginning of the class. 5 over 48. Classic, right? If you should think of a fraction. How can 5 over 48 comes out of the, like that? It sounds very strange. Well, here, remember we said, okay, it's a non-existence. If I look at a box, at a small box of size epsilon, and a box, say, of size roughly 1, existence of a path like that, of a circuit blocking, is basically the, it's 1 minus the probability, the absence of something like that is the existence of a path from inside to outside. Well, this for the CLE, because the CLE, so I didn't say, but if I take the CLE in another domain, the image by phi of another, by a conformal map of my domain, what am I going to get? Well, in the new domain, I can do two things. I can first just take the image of the limit that I got in my first domain, omega. But I could also just, in this new domain, take percolation, take the scaling limit, it will give me another loop ensemble. These two loop ensembles, they have the same law. This is exactly what would be given by conformal invariance. So this conformal loop ensemble has a lot of symmetries, so you can understand it very well. And in particular, when you look at the existence, at the absence of a path like that, of a circuit like that surrounding from there to there, you get that it's epsilon over 5 of 48 plus little of 1. So at least formally, when epsilon tends to 0, here if you put epsilon to be 1 over n, you exactly get the result there. So the truth is a little bit more complicated than that, but not much. Okay, so it's, my point is that this 5 over 48 comes from the properties of this model, of this conformal loop ensemble. These conformal loop ensembles, there are a lot of them. 6, I mean, here it's with some parameter, which is 6. In fact, for any kappa between 8 third and 8, you can get a conformal loop ensemble. If you would take another parameter kappa than 6, you would get another number here than 5 over 48. And then you will get another quantity here. So the fact that it's 5 over 48 simply comes from the fact that this percolation is matched to exactly this parameter 6. So there is nothing magical about this 5 over 48. It just comes from the computation. There is nothing here specific, like it doesn't come from the symmetries of percolation or anything like that. Just related to the fact that the scaling limit of percolation is this CAD6. Okay? Let me just maybe finish with that. I have like 1 or 2 more things to say, and then we make a break. So I know that this part, I mean, I'm not proving anything. Don't worry, I'm going to go back to proving things in 15 minutes. But I think it's nice to give you a little bit of description of what is happening at criticality. So this thing comes only from Rousseau-Seymour wedge. This thing, Rousseau-Seymour wedge plus this conformal invariance. It's not sufficient to have just Rousseau-Seymour wedge. There are many other things that are coming from Rousseau-Seymour wedge. So for instance, you can define other quantities of your model. So you can define, for instance, the probability at p of 0 connected to infinity. Okay? This, for p larger than pc, should decay like p minus 1/2 to some power. So let's call it beta plus little of 1 for p larger than pc. Let's assume something like that it behaves like that. And let's try to get beta. Well, there is another quantity that you can look at. So this is for p larger than pc, which is 1/2. Here, you could put this if you want. You can also look at the rate of decay below PC. So below PC, you know that it decays exponentially fast. That's what we proved last week. So you can look at L of P, at 1 over L of P, which is the infimum when n tends to infinity of minus 1 over n log of the probability of 0 connected to the boundary of the box of size n. So what is this thing? 1 over L of P is the rate of decay in the exponential. So this is defined for P smaller than PC. Well, L of P, what do you predict when P tends to PC? So we said at PC there is no exponential decay. So that means that 1 over L of P should tend to 0, right? That seems fairly natural. So that means L of P should tend to infinity. And indeed it does, and it's natural to predict that it does, like PC minus P, to some power, right? So let's call it minus nu. So beta and nu are what we call critical exponents. Okay? I also defined a critical exponent there. So I defined the probability at 1/2 of 0 connected to the boundary of the box of size n. I said it behaves like 1 over n to the alpha 1 plus little of 1, when alpha 1 is 5 over 48. Okay? So this is also a critical exponent. And let me give you a last critical exponent. You can look at the derivative of the probability at 1/2 of crossing a box of size n times n. So you look at that, and you look at p equal 1/2. So this, a priori, we know that this quantity is roughly half, but the derivative has no reason to be bounded or anything like that. And in fact, yeah?
I think it should be probability at p.
Yeah, from this point of view. Otherwise, it's not so interesting. Okay? So this is going to behave like n to the 2 minus alpha 4 plus little o of 1, in fact. So it's going to blow up faster and faster. I put 2 minus alpha 4 because you remember I said that probability derivative of an event is basically as a sum over the edges of the probability of being pivotal. Imagine basically that all the edges have the same probability of being pivotal. Then there are n square edges. So it's n square edges, and the probability of being pivotal is n to the minus alpha 4. So this exponent alpha 4 is basically describing the probability of being pivotal. I will go back to this later on if we need so. But here, so alpha 1, alpha 4, nu and beta are critical exponents. That's what we call a critical exponent. And notice that they are very different in nature somehow. Beta and nu, they are really the one that a physicist will be interested in because they are the one describing the phase transition. They are not at PC. Alpha 1 and alpha 4, they are guys that in fact describe really the fractal properties of the critical phase. They are at 1/2. The alpha 4, you can in fact prove it's the probability. So it's the probability of this event, which is having 2 arms like that and 2 dual arms like that. So it's really something that you can read from, that's the probability of this edge being pivotal for the crossing probability. So it's alpha 1, alpha 4, you can measure them at criticality. So in particular, if you prove convergence to CLE, you can determine alpha 1 and alpha 4. So I gave you one example. Alpha 1 is 5/48. And alpha 4 is 5/4. 7/4? 5/4. Why do I have? Sorry?
Over 8.
No, over 4. But now I have a double. It's 7/4 or 5/4. Okay, we are going to check that in a second.
You said it was the probability of having those crossings.
Sorry?
You said alpha 4 was the probability of having those two crossings, the blue one and the green one.
Yeah.
How can it be bigger than 1?
No, but passing through this edge. So it's the probability that this edge has 2 primal arms going from it and 2 dual arms. So it decays like 1/n to some power,
Okay.
which is 5/4 or 7/4. I'm always confused with it. 5/4. It has nothing to do with crossing, existence of 2 crossings or anything like that, because you need to go through 1 point. Okay. So this you can in fact get from CLE6. You can get from the scaling limit. But the other one, beta and nu, you cannot. If you think about it, well, how do I do? It's not at criticality, so I don't have the scaling limit to help me for that. But in fact, there is a theorem due to Kesten, and this is one of the most beautiful applications of the Rousseau-Semmelweis theory, which is that in fact, you can prove the following. You can prove that 2 minus, so the probability at 1/2 of 0, at p, of 0 connected to infinity is of the same order, it's roughly the same, as the probability at 1/2 of 0 connected to LP. So it's very strange. You have these quantities that are defined completely differently. LP is what we call the correlation length. It's defined like it's a number, which indeed is growing. And if I want to connect at p 0 to infinity, in fact, it's roughly the same probability as at 1/2 trying to connect 0 to LP. The idea, if I can give you just, this is a very complicated proof, but if I can give you a hint, is the following. Imagine LP as being the scale below this scale. You see, if I give you P equals 0.5000000000001, and I give you a box of size 1000, you will never be able to tell me that the configuration I'm throwing at you are different from the configuration I would be throwing at you if I would be sampling them from percolation at 0.5. Simply because the difference in the edge parameter is so small that almost never you will be, I mean, you cannot count, you see, for instance, if I give you P equals 0.8, you are just going to tell me, oh no, there are like roughly 800 guys which are open, so this is not P equal a half. But if I give you 0.5 plus something tiny, you cannot distinguish. If I give you 0.5 plus something tiny, but I give you n, which is huge compared to this tiny thing, then you will be already able to count and tell me, okay, no, that's different. That looks really like it's not 0.5. What is the limit? What is the point at which you can start to distinguish? Well, the limit is exactly this L of P. Now, if you can start to distinguish and you are above PC, that means that you start to really look supercritical, right? So it's natural to expect that if you want to connect 0 to infinity at P, if you start from LP, you already look like really supercritical, so it's going to be very easy to go to infinity, in fact. So you can prove uniformly that probability at P of connected LP to infinity is going to be larger or equal to, say, a half or something like that, uniformly in P, even if you get P very close to 0.5 to PC. So that means here that I can replace 0 connected to infinity by 0 connected to LP. Now, I'm getting closer, but I'm not here. I need to change P to 1/2. But I just told you LP is the shape is the scale at which you cannot really distinguish between critical and parameter P. So you can in fact replace this 1/2 by P. I mean, if you are not convinced by my proof, I say, okay, I agree with you because it's not a proof, right? I mean, just heuristic. Turning this into a proof is very difficult. And it's mostly based on the Rousseau-Simon wedge theory. It's really mostly based on that. Notice, and there is another one, which is that P minus PC times the derivative of the probability at 1/2. At 1/2 of this thing. This is roughly 1. And here, sorry, I should tell you what this is LP. So this is a theorem like that. This one is a little bit more complicated to see why it's true, but if you are really interested, you can come and harass me and I will explain. Why are these things nice? Let's look at this one. Here this behaves like, so corollary, or let's say like that. I promise I'm going to give you a break. This is P minus PC to the beta, right? Plus the total of 1. This guy is what? Probability at 1/2 of 0 connected to something is 1 over LP to the alpha 1, roughly. Okay? LP is PC minus P to the minus nu. So this is PC minus P to the nu alpha 1 plus the total of 1. So what did I just prove? I proved that beta is equal to nu times alpha 1. So it's LP to the 2 minus alpha 4. And this is equal to 1. So it's P minus PC. And L of P to the 2 minus alpha 4 is P minus PC to the minus nu times 2 minus alpha 4. So what do I deduce from that? I deduce that nu times 2 minus alpha 4 is equal to 1. Give me a second scaling relation. Maybe I should tell you here a little bit what it is. Here, this is what? This is roughly the integral imagine that this quantity for p equal 1/2 is basically the same for any s between 1/2 and p. This is decent because we are below the correlation length, okay? So we look critical. So this derivative should be the same as the one at 1/2. I see everybody looking there, sorry. Okay, so this quantity, it's decent to believe that here I can replace this by s for, I mean that it's the same as the one for s for any s in 1/2 p. Just because I am, you see, L of p is decreasing, right? So for any s between 1/2 and p, when I look at L of p, I am between L of s. So I am below the correlation length. I look like criticality. So this quantity should be the same. It should always be equal to the quantity at 1/2. But now, p minus pc times this, if I'm allowed to move 1/2 to s, this is like the integral between 1/2 and p of the derivative of this thing. So it is the probability of this at p minus the probability of this at 1/2. So already you see it's smaller or equal to 1. And in fact, you can prove that the probability of this at 1/2 is 1/2, but at L of p is not 1/2. It's actually close to 1. So this tells you that this quantity is really of order 1. And once again, this is not a proof. This is just heuristic. Turning this into a proof is complicated, but it really follows the intuition I gave you. Okay, we have these two scaling relations. How do we conclude? Well, this from alpha 4 get me nu. So it gives me nu times 3/4 equal 1. So it gives me nu equal 4/3. So the correlation lengths behave like pc minus p to the minus 4/3. And once I have nu, I can plug it here, and I get beta equal 4/3 times 5/48, and it gives me the 5/36. So you can get so this scaling relation of Kesten really give you the near critical exponents from the critical one. And this is something which is purely based on Rousseau-Simon-Welch theory. This Kesten result is actually 89 or something like that, maybe even earlier than that. So it's much earlier than the other results. Okay? So this is an example of an application of the Rousseau-Simon-Welch theory. There are many, many, many more. So this is like, there's basically not a single theorem about critical percolation in 2D which doesn't use Rousseau-Simon-Welch at some point. So this thing that seems so natural and so stupid somehow, like, okay, well, of course if you cross squares you are going to cross rectangles and so on. Without that you cannot do anything basically. It's really the core of the heart of the theory. Sorry to have gone over time, but like that we finish this chapter, so let's start around 30 or something like that to try to define, and I will go back to a normal style of lecture. So the first one is the FKG inequality. You understood why I asked you to do that. So the second one is exactly the definition of this L of P, this correlation length. Why it's well defined, why you can make sense of this thing. The third question, maybe you didn't realize, so what we did in the third question was to prove that if crossing a rectangle has too small probability, then you have exponential decay. So why is it, and not using duality? So if crossing probability is too small, then exponential decay at the same P. So that tells you exactly that, in fact, even if I'm not on the square lattice, take another lattice. At PC, I will have that the crossing probability do not tend to 0. So that's exactly how you get rid of this duality assumption. So this is this argument that you did in the second part. Then the question 4 was to prove that, okay, once you have exponential decay in radius of your cluster, in fact you also have exponential decay in volume, which was not clear a priori because you could have that, you could still have volume n squared by having radius n. It's not possible, in fact. That's what you prove here. Question 5 was the fact that theta of p, the probability of being connected to infinity, is also just the density of your cluster. if you take a box of size n, you look at the number of guys connected to the boundary of your box, it's roughly theta of p. So it's another interpretation, a statistical interpretation of your theta of p. So question 6 is exactly, is something which I told you, okay, for CLE, if you look between epsilon and distance 1, the probability of having a path is epsilon to the 5/48. And I told you, okay, now put epsilon equal 1 over n. And it gives you 1 over n to the 5/48. Of course, this is not allowed because when you prove convergence, the topology in which you are going to prove convergence doesn't allow you to pick epsilon equal 1 over n when you are at in a box of size 1 over, of a box with mesh size 1 over n, because then you get exactly down to the fine mesh size of the lattice, so you are not in the scaling limit regime. But what you can prove is that in fact the probability of 0 connected to the boundary of the box of size n is roughly like the probability of being connected to the boundary of the box of size epsilon n times the probability that the box of size epsilon n is connected to the box of size n. And this thing, so if you look at this thing, this event, when you look at the mesh size, is exactly connected a box of size epsilon to a box of size 1 in the mesh size 1 over n. So if you can indeed prove that you can cut somehow your probability of 0 connected to distance n into pieces which all look like that, all these quantities when n is going to tend to infinity are going to converge to something of probability epsilon to the 5/48. And when you are going to put all the pieces together, you are going to get that it gives you exactly that probability of 0 connected to distance n is 1 over n to the 5/48. So this property that you can cut is called the quasi-multiplicativity of the arm exponents or the arm events, and that's what you prove in question 6 for the one arm.
But it's to help to prove convergence?
So no, it's to help to extract the critical exponent here from the scaling limit. Well, you don't do it here because we didn't prove the convergence to scaling limit, but this would be a very important step to actually get from there to there. If you are more interested in this, I can give you an exercise really on that later on. Question 7, sorry for the others, but you can also listen because it's still related to the class somehow. Question 7 is exactly to say LP, I define it as rate of exponential decay. But in fact, you can define it differently. You can define it as the first L, the first length, for which this crossing probability is, say, 7/4, or 1 minus epsilon. You agree that if P is not equal to 1/2, say it's larger than, I define it for P smaller than PC. So let's say the first length at which this is smaller than epsilon. Because you know that because you are at P smaller than PC, the probability of this is going to decay exponentially fast, in fact. So at some point it's going to drop below epsilon, which is fixed. Take 1/4. Okay. It's going to drop below 1/4. Well, define L of P to be the first time where it drops below that. Well, it's not defined, let's call it L tilde of P. It's not obvious it's equal to L of P, and in fact it is, up to constant. It's the same order of magnitude. And that's exactly what is going to allow you here to say not only it's smaller or equal to 1, as I said, because it's the difference of two probabilities, but it's also larger or equal to 1/4, in fact, because you go from 1/2 to 1/4. So this was the object of question 7, and also to prove to you that going from LP to infinity costs you something which is uniform. Question 8 was just to speak about more complicated arms events with many arms going, like many paths going from 0 to the boundary, which is also useful for these things. And question 9 is related to what we call universal exponents. So they are, this 5/48, you cannot get it just from Rousseau-Seymour-Welch. You need convergence to SLE. But there are a few exponents that you can get directly from Rousseau-Seymour-Welch, and just from it. And these are the following arm events. So one is just, you go on the boundary, you look at 0, and you look at the probability of having an open path from 0 to distance n, and a closed path from 0 to distance n. Well, this is 1 over n, the probability. And you can use it only, you can prove it using only Rousseau-Seymour wedge. So the exponent, the critical exponent here, which is 1 in this case, you can get it only from Rousseau-Seymour wedge, which is something kind of surprising somehow, that you don't need more than that. You have this one, which is 0, and you take these 3 ones. And they are useful, these exponents. They are not like just, oh, it's funny, I can get it from Rousseau-Seymour wedge. They are useful. This one is going to be 1 over n squared. And this one, five arms like that, that in the plane, so starting from 0, here it's not in the, here it's on the boundary, here it's in the plane, is 1 over n squared as well. And so these 3 exponents, they are called universal, and in particular, if you take other dependent models, they will also be equal to that. The 5 over 48 is going to change if you take other models, but these ones, they don't change. Notice here that 1 over n squared tells you something funny, because it tells you, okay, I need 5 arms here. Let's kill this one. Let's say now I want only 4. Should be easier, right? It is easier, but it's really easier by really an exponent. You can earn an exponent. What did you just prove here? You prove that the probability that this edge is pivotal is larger than 1 over n to the 2 minus epsilon. So it tells you that the derivative here, since I have basically n squared edges, is going to be larger than n to the epsilon. So it blows up when n tends to infinity. That sounds like a very useless statement. First, that's kind of a statement I use here anyway. So the alpha 4 was indeed smaller than 2, the exponent alpha 4. But this is historically how it was proved that PC equal 1/2. They proved this n to the epsilon for the derivative, and they used that to prove that, you see, it tells you that this thing is not going to stay close to 1/2 for long. It's going to tend very quickly to 1 when n is larger, when p is larger than 1/2, and it's going to drop very quickly to 0 when p is smaller than 1/2. And that's exactly what Kesten used to prove that, in fact, that means that for p smaller than 1/2, I am subcritical, and for p larger than 1/2, I am supercritical. So this small observation is very useful. So that was the object of the last exercise. Proving this exponent. These two are a little bit more complicated, but of course I put the 3 in the first thing that I sent to Matan, and he told me that I was crazy. So I removed the 2 others. But, okay, so that was just to illustrate the fact that, to give a little bit of context for all these exercises. There are a lot of them. You are not forced to do all of them, of course, but I think it's interesting to have, they have some content, so it's interesting too. Okay, that was Bernoulli percolation. Now we get to something more complicated. Okay, because the problem with Bernoulli percolation, okay, there is independence, very good, but it's not the geometric representation of any model. So for us, it's not so useful because our goal is ultimately to get information on our spin models. So we are going to introduce now, in chapter 3, a new class of percolation models with dependency this time. And my goal is to show to you that there are a few things that change and many that don't. So chapter 3, the random cluster model. So this random cluster model, it's sometimes called Fortuyn-Castellan model because it was introduced by Fortuyn and Castellan in the 70s. And sometimes I'm even going to call it FK percolation. But, all these things, they are the same model. And the good thing with these models is that they are going to be related to the Potts models. So let's start by defining this. So it's a percolation model. Configurations are going to be just configuration on open and closed edges. But here, because of dependency, a little bit like for the Ising model or for spin models, I'm going to need to define the notion of boundary conditions. If I look at a graph G, which is a subset of ZD, a finite graph, I mean, it's not just sufficient for percolation. I could just look at this graph, don't care about anything outside, because anyway it was independent of what is outside. Here I need to be a little bit more careful. So a boundary psi is going to be a boundary condition. A boundary condition psi is going to be a partition P1 Pk of the boundary of G. I think I defined already the vertex boundary, or I didn't, I don't remember. Well, let's just recall what it is. So the vertex boundary is just going to be the vertices of your graph G, so that there exists a guy outside of G which is neighbors of Y, neighbors of X. So that's the people that have one neighbor outside my graph. So I take a partition of this thing. I'm going to give a few examples afterwards. Well, I can give examples now. So for instance, the first thing is going to be the free boundary conditions. So it's just when you take psi to be just the union over the X in G of the singleton X. So you don't, it's just everybody is singleton. So you should understand the boundary conditions. It's going to be what we are going to, that's why I defined it later on. Yeah. Think of the partition as encoding who is connected to who outside the graph. Okay? The idea is two guys in the same partition. Somehow I'm basically saying outside the graph they are connected. So here that means free boundary condition just means no connection outside my graph. I don't care about what happened outside, no boundary condition. And here in general we are going to define it. The notation is going to be, we are going to write 0 instead of 3. There is another, you are going to understand why next week. I can also define the wired boundary conditions. So wired boundary conditions are just, well, the partition is just one guy, which, everybody in my boundary. So that means everybody is connected a priori, like from outside the graph. And there the boundary, the notations is going to be written 1, wired boundary conditions. We are going to see many others. We are going to see, for instance, the Dobrushian boundary conditions are going to be that if I take a domain, half the boundary is going to be wired, the other half will not be, so I will go back to this later on. But you can also see, for instance, imagine you like a lot tori, which happens to people here. So if you like the torus, you can see it as lambda n, the box lambda n, with some boundary condition, which is going to be this guy is connected to this guy. This guy is connected to this guy. This guy is connected to this guy, and so on. Okay? I'm not saying that this should be encoded by something that looks planar. So you can construct periodic boundary conditions by just saying, okay, I0 is connected to IN, and 0i is connected to n0, to ni. Okay? That gives you a torus, an effective torus. It's like your graph is now on a torus. Your model is on a torus. Let me give you a last example, which is important, is imagine I give you psi, just a configuration in 0, 1 to the edges of ZD minus the edges of G. So I give you a percolation configuration outside my graph. This guy, it induces a boundary condition on my graph by saying simply, I'm going to say that xy belong to the same pi if x is connected to y in psi. Right? If they are connected together, I'm going to say that's exactly why we introduce somehow these boundary conditions, to exactly take this into account. So when I do like that, I adjust the notation, I use psi for the boundary condition itself that is induced by this configuration. So let's go, maybe I should write it like that. And in this case, we write psi equal psi hat. We identify the boundary condition with the percolation configuration that induces it. Do you understand now why psi equals 0 for free boundary conditions? If I take this definition and I take the boundary, the configuration, which is just everybody is closed, then the pi are just the singletons because nobody is connected in this configuration. On the other hand, if I take a nice domain, because there could be problem with holes, but if you take a domain without holes, if I take psi equal 1 here, then everybody on the boundary is connected, so I get exactly this boundary condition. So that's the reason for this 0 and 1 boundary condition, for this notation. Okay. So this is a notion of boundary conditions. Now let's define the measure associated to it. So there are going to be a few things. So let's O of omega to be just the number of open edges in omega. Let's call it C of omega to be the number of closed edges in omega. And let's call K of omega to be the number of clusters in omega, where a cluster is I already defined cluster, no? No, maybe not. Is a maximal connected component of omega. Okay? So remember that the percolation configuration can be seen as a subgraph of G by taking the same set of vertices and open edges as a set of edges. So it has some connected components, maximal connected components. I call them clusters. Okay? So here I'm just counting the number of clusters in omega. Okay, I think we are basically there. The last definition is going to be the following. Omega psi, like that, is just the graph omega when I quotient by the relation given by this partition. So I identify vertices which are in the same partition. So it's omega where vertices in the same pi are identified. This is, I mean, I'm just going to use it for the definition, so I don't want to spend too much time, and it's going to be clear what I mean by that. So now, definition. The random cluster measure with, on G, with edge weight P in 0, 1. So far so good, it looks very much like percolation. Now, cluster weight. So there is a new parameter, which is a cluster weight. Q larger than 0, strictly. And boundary condition, psi. So there's edge parameter, cluster weight, and boundary condition is given, is a measure, is given by. So the probability of a configuration, I'm going to define it by just defining what it is equal to on a configuration. So the probability of a configuration is going to be P to the number of open edges 1 minus p to the number of closed edges. So far, what is it? If I just write that, this is Bernoulli percolation. I'm just saying every edge is open or closed with probability p. I mean, p and 1 minus p. But here I add q to the clusters counted in omega psi. So be careful. That means, for instance, if psi is equal to 0, I mean, if it's free boundary condition, just the number of clusters in my configuration. But if I take wired boundary conditions, I identify all the vertices on the boundary, so they are automatically in the same cluster. So that exactly boils down to counting clusters in omega, but all the clusters on the boundary are just counted as one, not as different clusters. Okay? And if I just write like that, this is not a probability measure, a priori. So I'm going to divide by a certain number, which is just normalizing my quantity. So here, this is for every omega in 0, 1 to the edges of G. Good. So this is a definition of my probability measure. So a few remarks there. Q equal 1, what do I get? I get Bernoulli percolation, right? This is 1, so then it's just Bernoulli percolation. So this is a model which is extending the definition of generalizing Bernoulli percolation. Notice that as soon as Q is not equal to 1, somehow there is this term, which is a very local term. This is just, if I look at an edge, I know this one is contributing P or 1 minus P, because it's either closed or open. This term here is a topological term. It looks really at the whole configuration and tells me, okay, there is this number of clusters. Looking at this edge doesn't tell me if, for instance, the two endpoints are in the same cluster or not. So this is a very different term from this point of view. So Q to the k of omega, it's sometimes called a topological term, and it induces correlation. Okay, now it's not true that you have independence when Q is not equal to 1. So this is going to be where the dependency comes from, the long-range dependency comes from. So that was another thing. So then, yet another comment is z psi of GPQ is just there to renormalize, and it's called the partition function. And it's also equal to the sum over every omega in 0, 1 to the edges of p to the number of open edges, 1 minus p to the number of closed edges, and q to the number of clusters is the partition function. So this you probably saw. First, we saw partition functions for spin models. You also probably saw a few examples in the class of Ivan, is a partition function. That was the third remark. And the fourth remark is going to be more of a notation thing. So phi psi GPQ is going to denote the measure and the expectation with respect to this measure as well. Okay. So denotes both the measure and the expectation with respect to this measure. This is kind of a useless thing to say. It's just that for percolation, usually you write, so this is just a parenthesis, you don't need to write that, but I just want to justify this thing. This is a percolation, the percolation measure. Usually you are going to write this thing for the expectation, if you want the expected number of clusters or something like that. This is a very probabilistic thing to do, to denote differently the measure and its expectation. There is no reason to do it whatsoever if you think about it, because in measure theory, when you have a measure mu, you can take mu of a function f. There is no problem with that, right? So here we are going to do that. We are not going to introduce another notation for the expectation. So just be a little bit careful when I'm writing phi of something to check whether it's phi of an event or phi of a function. That's just, there won't be any trouble with that, but sometimes it's, people don't like it, so it's better to. Okay, and I'm going to just finish on stating the first nice thing about this result, about this model, is that I should say why it was introduced. So these are natural models for q equals 0. You can almost define this thing for q equals 0, at least as a limiting thing. It's just saying that you want a minimal number of clusters. So you want your thing to be connected. And this is going to be related, in fact, to electrical network theory. And electrical network theory satisfies this very nice property that if you have a graph and say you have two edges between, like with P and P prime edge weights for these guys, then you can replace it. These are like resistances in parallel. You can replace it by one edge with P prime over P plus P prime. And if you have two guys in parallel, like in series like that with P and P prime, you can replace it by a resistance on only one edge. Well, these models are actually a general class of models that satisfies these properties. And they were introduced like that. It just, as such, it's interesting, but what happened very quickly is that they realized that it has a much nicer property, which is the following property, which is a coupling. So Fortune Castellane realized that, sorry, which is the fact that, well, it's maybe two, that there is a coupling with the Potts model. And I'm just going to state the theorem and we will prove that next week. And you are going to see it's very simple. So the Potts model, it's a random coloring of vertices of my graph. My random cluster model is just a percolation configuration. How do I get a random coloring from a percolation configuration? Well, what I can do is the following. I have my percolation configuration, and I'm just going to say guys in the same cluster, they must receive, it's like, it gives me information on the correlation. It must receive the same spin. Let's decide that this is my rule. And let's decide that then if they are not in the same clusters, I'm going to give different spins independently. So let's do the following from a configuration omega. What you're going to do is for any cluster C of omega, attribute of sigma of omega, sigma of C, in your spin space, TQ. Okay? Uniformly. So for every guy you do it independently, uniformly, and independently. Now, if you have that, you can deduce a configuration, a coloring by just saying now you obtain sigma. Sigma is obtained by setting sigma of x for a vertex is going to be sigma of C where x is a vertex of C. So for every vertex in my connected component C, I give exactly the spin which is sigma C. Okay? So it's clear for everybody? So you have a percolation configuration for every cluster. You sample uniformly, independently of everything else, one spin, and then you give it to everybody in the cluster. So from omega, you get a sigma. This, you can start from any percolation configuration and do it with any Q. But the proposition is the following, is that so let Q be larger or equal to 2, and it's an integer necessary, then, and P in 0, 1, then if omega is sampled according to the free boundary condition random cluster measure on G with parameter P and Q, then if. Then sigma is sampled according to the measure mu of the Potts model, G beta Q with free boundary conditions. And I need to tell you what beta means, what beta is, where beta is equal to, let me check just that I'm not, Q minus 1 over Q log of 1 over 1 minus P. So there is a coupling. I can construct sigma from omega. I just sample a random cluster measure, and I get a Potts measure. So this is a Potts measure. So the random coloring that I obtain at the end is exactly as a law of a Potts model. And if I start from free boundary condition here, I get free here. And just the beta is related to the P through this very simple relation here. And this is going to be the start of a beautiful story. Because then this provides us with a dictionary between properties of my random cluster measure and properties of my Potts measure. And we are going to see that this coupling actually extends to wired boundary condition to get here 1 instead of 3. And then exactly then we are going to exactly get a coupling, a geometric representation as I defined it in the first class. And so that's going to be nice. Okay, so we see each other next week. Thank you very much.